we will have a long afternoon because we have 5 presentations. So I will ask all the presentators to keep to the schedule, which is what, about 25 minutes presentation each, then followed by question. So we'll start by a third session on called "One or Many Diplomacies for the Climate of Cities for the Climate," and we will have 2 very distinguished political scientists from the US and from Italy and the UK.
for a little bit, for a year at least.
So we'll start by I will start by giving the floor to Michele Acuto on the topic of convergence, one of many policies, convergence and divergence in city networking. The floor is yours.
Oh, brilliant, and thanks for the chance to show you a few things. I promise I'll only flick through a few slides. Hopefully you can hear me fine. Let's do that. Good. Awesome. Yeah, that's good. As long as it's good for the rest. There's a few slides that I strongly encourage you not to read, or your eyes might fall apart, especially as after lunch entertainment. I guess that what I was asked to contribute, yes, a little bit in reflection on C40. I think I have to do outing up front instead of at the back like Jeb. So I direct a thing called the City Leadership Lab at UCL, and one of the main things we do is we do quite a lot of work with C40 cities, with ARP, quite recently we were Rockefeller 100 as well. So to be clear that some of these things in fact actually come from a little bit of that kind of work, and I'll go back to that at the end as to why that matters or not. In this kind of conversation. But I guess that the 3 things that I wanted to do, and hopefully segues decently into Dave's presentation and from Harriet's notes, was to talk a bit about the context in which city networking, environmental and broader, is happening. First and foremost, because it seems to me and to us working behind this, that there's a little too much focus on the environmental side. The environmental reality is part of a much broader reality of city networking and city diplomacy. Put a bit of numbers to trends, paradoxically not so much driven by the academic side of things, but by having worked with quite a lot of networks in the last 4 years of the lab. Working with things like WHO Healthy Cities, C40, ICLEI, and so forth, really pushed us to do much more evidence, tangible evidence as to the landscape of city diplomacy. So that's the main thing I wanted to try and do with a view, and this is a bit new because we literally just finished some of this work, so I'll just have a few things up there, but with a view at seeing this from the city network as much as seeing it from the city's perspective, and whether those 2 stories actually coincide, collide, clash, in which ways. So the things that I'm going to show you, some of which you can read, some of which you shouldn't be reading, are mostly out of 3 pieces of work that we've done. So it isn't just my work, it's work from the lab. In fact, the lab stuffed with French because Enora Robin and Hugo de Cramer are behind most of this work, especially social network analysis. But we've been working for quite some time in looking at the landscape of city networks. So we've updated, and we have a database of about 200. It's just over 200, but we stick to 200 as the data set of 200 city networks. So formal organizations whose main membership is cities. But we also in 2016, at the end of the year, worked on a technical working group that we have that has 25 city networks of various varieties. So it has C40, Rockefeller 100, ICLEI, UCLG, and so forth. And we just finished a technical working group with 30 global cities or 30 larger cities, looking at the story from City Hall rather than from the city networks. Some of you might have seen it, but it sort of speaks to the issue of, do we see a growth in city networking and city diplomacy? So that's number of city networks total number of city networks per year. Clearly, it matches well what Harriet's diagram of the growth in urban experiments. We have more and more experiments. We have more and more networks, formal networking between cities. This is what it looks like if you look at it from the city's perspective. So this is the map of all the cities that are part of a city network internationally. You can look at it this way, and you can look at it this way, which is all the cities that are connected to each other in city networks, or you can simply look at the actual numbers. I guess the message there being there's been not just a sprawl of city networking, but also that it doesn't exactly map onto the usual suspects. So it is the likes of Barcelona and Paris that are the cities with most membership to city network. But then there's quite a variety. In fact, for instance, it's quite striking that Cape Town makes much more of a formalized effort at engaging in city networking than, for instance, New York or San Francisco or indeed Shanghai. And that's the first one that will cross your eyes. That's mapping all the cities that are part of city networks respective to their networks, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it is to say there are very large networks with a lot of cities that are in fact just part of that network, classic case, Mayors for Peace or the Climate Alliance. And where the real networking action is happening at the moment is really sort of in that cloudy area where you have lots of cities like Barcelona, like, in fact, New York, Strasbourg, Helsinki, and so forth, that are putting themselves in between a variety of networks. So basically what you're looking at is a social network analysis of all the member cities of all the 200 city networks that we looked at. And what's interesting in a sense is that there is a progressive creation of networks that have a vastly overlapping membership, that have vastly overlapping networking capacity, but this doesn't necessarily translate then into collaboration, into effective sort of cross-sectorial, for instance, work between the networks. One thing that it translates on is that you have cities like Paris that have been very, very clever in putting themselves on the map and in pushing for certain agendas. So a typical example is Paris taking over as chair of C40 and pushing for a more women-centric agenda on climate change. That is despite the fact that all of this is happening, and this is part of what I'm going to go back and back and back and back to, that all of this we tend to divorce quite a bit, especially academically, from the broader landscape, if you wish, of sort of global urban governance, or so simply the global governance landscape. And for instance, the fact that, sure, we have initiatives like Women for Climate, but globally, the gender balance between mayors that are women and not is pretty striking. So first and foremost, first thing I wanted to flag was, yes, there has been a growth in city networking and city diplomacy, but it's a growth that happens in context. That environment is probably driving this massive sprawl. Sustainability is driving the sprawl of connections between and of cities, but it happens within a number of other things. So, for instance, this is of those 200 city networks, what kind of geographies do they cover? Sure, international city networks are on the rise, but national politics still count a lot. There are still a lot of national networks. And in fact, the regional networks, so region-focused politics by cities on a transnational scale is on the rise at the moment. That despite the rise of international networks, there are still signs of at least continuing regionally focused networks. Interestingly, in Europe, a decline between 2000 and now in the region-focused networks. And I guess the more interesting one, this is what kind of topics do city networks globally cover. There's clearly a story of diversification, of growth, but I think that the interesting one for us here isn't just the continuous growth of the environmental focus of city networking, but the sprawl of what we will have classified as other, so this in terms of what their primary focus of activity is, so the growth of multi-purpose networks that are in fact not just a climate story or an energy story or a gender story and so forth. And the big difference when you take the national out, so if you take the national city networks, bottom part, and the international city networks, top part, you literally see this large split. National city networks remain mostly multi-topical initiatives focused on mostly governance matters. International city networks have literally sprawled in the sustainability domain, in the mixed domain of the other. And to give you first a snapshot of what does it look like from City Hall, as this explosion of networking or expansion of networking is happening, clearly the dominance of sustainability and environment as one of the catalysts of city networking is translating into practice. So what you're looking at is, again, in these 30 cities internationally, has city network resulted in more or less or specific safety, smart, or sustainability strategies on the ground. So things like C40 now push or require the implementation of sustainability strategy. Sustainability really sits at the heart of many cities. It isn't the same case, for instance, with safety and networks that look at urban safety and security. Second, that we tend to talk about networking in the context of networking, but networking has a deep impact on the governance, the form of urban government itself. That I would disagree that is just about mayors. This is having tangible and practical impacts on the way certain cities at least are being governed. So for instance, one interesting fact is that if internationally most networks are for 54% of city networks see themselves and have a meeting pattern that is an annual meeting pattern in a sense, with more or less regular touch base. If you look below, what you have above is how often city networks see themselves meeting. What you look at below is how often cities engage directly with city networks. How often do they pick up the phone and call a city network, for instance, or when do they send emails? And it was disproportionate for us that on a daily and on a weekly basis, cities that are not just the large global ones, we included medium-sized ones as well, are in regular contact with the landscape of city networking. And they are in regular contact, and this is out of a project that we did last year with ARP and C40, because, and this doesn't mean anything, by the way, it simply means no statistical correlation between having a lot of powers as a city and taking a lot of climate and environmental action. So city, and that's a better representation of it, it just simply is this grouped by types of governance. So if you group cities by types of governance, at least in C40, so you take those 90 cities and you divide them by whether there are cities that have very much individual top-down activity in governance, or you go the more collaborating cities that might not have lots of powers but are connected to lots of actors in delivering their projects. It is clear, and it remains clear, that at least in C40, but I would argue in most of the networks that we're looking at, it is the cities that collaborate, it is the cities that engage with other actors that are, first of all, delivering more actions, but also they're delivering more action, and that's the blue part of that, that are scaling up, that are being moved from just experimental of the likes of what Harriet was talking about to citywide programs. And to flag so the mode of engagement, the mode of engagement is also quite curious. The majority of city networks still goes through the mayors and the international office. It isn't going particularly deep. So when you ask cities, okay, who is in charge of city networking or city diplomacy in your city, that's the kind of answers you get. A chief advisor, someone that is integrated in some kind of office, someone that sits within the executive of the city. And equally, when you ask, okay, what sort of ways are you a member of a network, the normal answer is we applied to be a member of something, or we were invited in a few cases. But what's interesting, and again, that's out of our technical group of city networks, is that despite the fact that most city networks charge membership fees, there's a growth in the smaller ones, the threes there, networks that don't charge fees, but require annual reporting criteria. They require an endorsement of the network. They require some physical change in the city. And that's where gets to maybe the story of, okay, where's the actual impact? So if you take city networks globally, the story starts then splitting apart. This is what you're looking at is the budget trends of city networks globally, and they're being quite a bit split. You have quite a few networks that have seen a somewhat decrease on how much money they're putting on the table or they have available to do their activities, versus certain large numbers of networks that are increasing their budgets. And if you look at physically how much money do city networks have, yes, the overall isn't that bad. You're talking about 1 to 5 million being the most common budget of a city networks international. But you also have that 6% of large outliers, the like of C40, the likes of Rockefeller 100, that have budgets of 10 to 50 millions a year. You're talking about not just PR or communications efforts. You're talking about efforts that, for instance, like Rockefeller 100, can physically put on the ground quite a lot of things. So, for instance, Rockefeller 100, creating new governance structures in the cities that they work with. So that to flag, the networking has a deep impact. I'll skip a couple of things not to bug you too much, but it has a deep impact because the landscape that you looked at before with city networks would be incomplete if we didn't plug in the partners. So this is what happens when you plug in the actual partners of the networks. And let me just take you deeper in one example. Private partners to city networking initiatives, like for instance Arab between 100 Brazilian cities and C40, are becoming critical nodes of all this network architecture. So Arab delivers most of the research of C40, is delivering more and more strategic research for Rockefeller 100, and it is really that networked link between networks of cities. And it is because the private partners, that's again, C40 research, what you're looking at is who pays for the stuff that C40 cities deliver. And who pays in these networks, despite these large budgets, remain local government. That cities have mostly funded their own C40 initiatives, and that the majority of those ones have been funded as citywide landscape. So what I would flag is that there's that right next to the unavoidable understanding that the majority of services in local governments globally are in fact delivered by private sector, by things like large waste management industries. And maybe it is worth a closer look, and there's very little and certainly nearly no systematic analysis of the role of the private partners in all of this. On the role of what's being called, for instance, philanthrocapitalism, on the impact that something like the Clinton Climate Initiative, Rockefeller Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies are having in shaping the kinds and the forms and the dynamics of city networking, which if Harriet and Christine Kern had called sort of the early C40s or the newer ICLEs, the sort of the second wave of city networking, the question is whether that second wave is in fact changing into a third wave, is being privatized into a third wave. C40 is all entirely privately funded at the moment, for instance. And what kind of new drivers of networkings are there in place? And the last thing that I wanted to flag was that you can't tell the story of which drivers if you simply tell the story of city networking. The same way you can't tell the story of city networking if you only tell the story of environmental city networking. So for instance, if you put this in context of global urban governance, you will tell the stories of that's the C40 mayors and the Paris Agreement now a couple of years ago. It's a beautiful story, but that kind of stories need to sit in the context of processes like, for instance, the Habitat 3 New Urban Agenda, like the Addis Ababa Agenda for Financing Sustainable Development, like the Sustainable Development Goals. So all these sort of processes are not just in the background. I would state that it's actually quite the opposite, that your networks are being and are trying to plug themselves into this broader global urban politics. And the things that happen, so what you're looking at is the landscape of Habitat 3, or how Habitat 3 happened, how these are sort of all the major actors inputting issues on the agenda of Habitat 3. So if you map not just the networks, but the networks in their context, you start seeing sort of, that's probably an easier way to look at it, you probably see a fairly different story. You see these networks, yes, being close to the center, but not at the center, the big blue dot at the center of the new urban agenda formation, the policy units and the negotiations, for instance. Yes, you see some cities having some access to the room, but cities remain relatively collateral to bigger processes. And you see some private actors being critical in connecting some assumed very large networks, say Rockefeller 100, into some very large global governance initiatives, like, for instance, Habitat 3. So if you look at the bottom end, you can see ARP being quite a critical link between Rockefeller 100 and the Habitat 3 process. Or the traditional, if I can use the term, networks that have been there for longer, Cities Alliance, ICLEI, UCLG, being more plugged in into the global urban governance than others. And the side note on that is that then we haven't even started talking about the things that are city networking, that are global connections, but in fact are not run by City Hall itself. So for instance, we have, with a colleague, Jean-Paul Addy, we have a project on the role of universities in networking cities and university in reshaping urban governance. In London, just about a few meters from City Hall, we have 41 universities. They're connecting globally and moving urban expertise and plugging it into local government. And that sort of stuff rarely gets taken into account when we talk about the landscape of city networking. One of the things that we're starting, in fact, at the end of the week is an international expert panel organized by UCL and Nature on the science policy interface. And one of the critical things that rarely gets talked about when we talk about city networking or city diplomacy is where is the information coming from. That the information that you can, for instance, find in the CAM3 report or Power in Climate Action reports of C40 was in fact developed and analyzed and in fact mostly sourced by ARP, a private company, and UCL, a university, was processed by a joint team that went through, in a sense, a negotiation of what kind of information gets out, and was communicated by the likes of Bloomberg and so forth, and was provided to the networks. So, in a sense, if you set all of this in context, if you look at the bigger picture of the trends, and if you try to look at it a bit inside out, not just in the flatness of the networks, I would say, last slide, that the key things that are on the agenda now, that the key things that we should pay a bit more attention to is, first of all, this whole landscape is political and what kind of politics of urban governance are there if it is all networked. There's been more and more writing about the possible Darwinian selection of city networks. Will the 1 to 5 million city networks die out because the 10 to 50 million networks are the big game in town? Or will there be a different transformation, a review of the shift of what urban governance looks like? That it is critical to maybe place yourself a bit in between academia and the practice, to have access to the full story, to have access to some of the details, that studying these things from the outside in an ethnographic way, for instance, might not get you to the whole landscape, but also studying it from the inside allows you those sort of pushes of saying, okay, give me the actual data of the trends. And I guess the last thing there, seeing and continuing seeing this as part of a bigger political piece, a bigger global urban governance architecture. My colleague Supernell and I are writing quite a lot about it at the moment because there's been so much divorcing of the story. And in fact, maybe going back a bit more to what Harriet and Michele were writing on multi-level governance and seeing city networks as a representation of some kind of multi-level governance. Might sound passé, but we literally never plug this into the UN system, if not in the environmental sphere by talking about UNFCCC and the IPCC. So that's my 2 cents on city networking, hopefully helpful.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And appreciate the chance to be here and have the chance, the ability to speak today and share some thoughts with you. And it's always, Michele is a tough act to follow, so this will be a slightly less Urban Lab supported presentation. But one in which I think it maybe sort of spins off, especially the latter point that Michele was making about the importance of thinking about the politics of these networks, and that's essentially the sort of emphasis and thrust of what I have to say today. And in some sense, this is motivated by something that I've found to be kind of puzzling ever since I started thinking about or looking into the issue of cities and global climate governance, and something that Harriet mentioned earlier, which is this notion of cities being the strange beast who have a proclivity of standing up and saying, look at us and how responsible we are for doing all sorts of, or producing all sorts of bad things in the world. Right? And in some sense, I've always understood that as a claim by cities to say, hey, you should hold us accountable. And I find that to be a really interesting sort of phenomenon. On one hand, I think it's about the claims to legitimacy and inclusion and authority, but I've increasingly come to start thinking about it in terms of what that claim to accountability, what it does, right? How it manifests, what it means for cities to be globally accountable, what kind of implications or impacts that has, and how it's leveraged and made use of by cities and the various other sorts of actors that Michele sort of set out in some of his social network diagrams. So that's what the story is I want to tell you today, is a story about the emergence of a phenomenon of global urban accountability. And thinking about this in terms of both the process and a politics of global urban climate governance. And so the story I'm going to tell you is a story in 4 parts. The first one is, I want to give you some brief overview, some very basic descriptives of the increased uptake of cities, of various and very specific practices that are aimed at enhancing the legibility of cities, the ability for cities to become comprehensible to global actors and global audiences. And behind all of this, I want to stress this point, is that it's the globalness of these audiences that I think matters and makes things distinct and different when we're talking about accountability in its relation to the urban here. So I'm going to give you some brief descriptives. Second, I'm going to link that up and suggest that these practices that are being taken up by cities, practices of quantification, of measurement, of reporting and disclosure, have been fused to an underlying set of principles, and principles related to the global accountability of cities. And this is a global accountability that I think can be sort of unpacked into 3 distinct dimensions, but those dimensions are sort of layered on top of one another. And when you put them together, what we see is the emergence of accountability as a tool of governance, a means of producing order amongst cities, right? A means of attempting to overcome some of the limitations of the voluntariness of network coordination, of the sort of city networks that we've been talking about today. Thirdly, I'm going to link that to what I think is the mechanism that's underneath all of this, that drives it and makes it possible, which is the notion of recognition. I think there's an interesting sort of politics and political economy of recognition taking place. And recognition here being essentially the lever, the Archimedean lever that enables actors to produce cities as particular kinds of actors, to give them that order in order to be able to bring them into alignment with a particular set of ideals and practices and potentially craft them into a collectively meaningful entity. And then lastly, I just want to chart out 3 possible pathways forward in terms of what this all might lead to. One of possibility, one of peril, and one, I think, simply raising questions about the kind of research that might be needed in the future. So, thinking first of all about the kinds of practices that, that cities are engaging in. So as I mentioned, there's been a distinctive uptake of a very specific set of practices over the past 6 or 7 years, all related to enhancing the legibility of cities, so making them, as I said, comprehensible to outside audiences. So these aren't practices that are necessarily all that novel. We're talking about, again, things that ecology has been doing ever since it was created in the 1990s, right? Getting cities to measure their emissions, to quantify and to track them over time, right? To disclose those and use them as a way of measuring their performance. But it's only in very recent years that these practices have become systematized and used in a more sort of comprehensive manner. And when ICLEI was undertaking these as part of its 5 milestone framework, they were done so in a way that was more enabling, right? They provided tools and capacity to cities, but sort of said, go do with this as you will, and there wasn't much of an effort to track or sort of monitor these things or standardize them in any particular way. Since 2011, however, we see that there's been a shift, right? Through the creation of independent third-party platforms such as the CDP Cities Initiative and the Carbon Climate Registry. Right? We've seen the creation of, and excuse me, we've seen the creation of platforms that encourage and allow for cities to become more systematic in terms of their sort of disclosing themselves to these sort of public audiences or global audiences. So we see this in the sense of an increased number of cities disclosing their emissions inventories, their targets, their actions, to some extent the effects or implications of those actions. We can see up here CDP, this is the last report that they had issued, is up now to sort of over 500 cities participating voluntarily in these platforms. You can see a steady increase over time in the figure below in terms of the number of cities disclosing. This is a pattern that holds up fairly steadily across geographic regions. So while you see an overrepresentation in North American, European cities, there are also a substantial number of cities in South America, Asia, Australasia, Africa, and the Middle East who are participating in these and have adopted these practices. We can see similar patterns of increase across these different regions. You could also see that cities are coming to disclose more of what they do. Right? So they're not simply cherry picking, they're disclosing more of their emissions, targets, and actions, and more of them are disclosing all of these three things in concert. There's also an increased frequency of disclosure, so I don't think I have a figure up here for it. But cities are coming to disclose more regularly, right? So demonstrating a stronger commitment to these principles and practices of disclosure. So on their own, these trends are interesting, but not terribly so. But what I think gives them some greater degree of import, and what I want to suggest is that they matter because they've become fused to an underlying set of principles, right? And those are the principles of global urban accountability. It's the idea that cities are now responsible to a distinctive set or a very particular global audience. And this is a very novel orientation. This runs, quite differently than standard lines of accountability that operate in municipal governments, which would run either to local citizens or to upper levels of national or regional or subnational government. Right? This is a sort of furthering of the disembedding of cities and the engaging them in these sort of global networks and relationships, but in a very sort of novel and distinctive way, I think. And as I mentioned, I think you could sort of take this apart into three distinct dimensions, each of which, though, layer upon one another and constitute an effort to try to produce order, to govern cities in very particular ways. So in the first instance, one way in which cities are becoming globally accountable is something we might think of as a sort of a symbolic accountability. And this is illustrated in efforts to sort of integrate cities into the broader global climate regime. Since 2008 or 9, the mantra was cities act while nations talk. And this created an imperative for cities to demonstrate the extent to which that's true. Right? So there's a sort of thin layer of accountability here in terms of holding cities up to this sort of notion that it's their action orientation, their propensity for action that makes them sort of authoritative and legitimate actors. And so it creates a thin level of accountability in terms of being able to secure them, being able to demonstrate that that is in fact the case. As been mentioned before, there's sort of various reasons through which the UN has become interested in bringing cities in and participating in this sort of, or facilitating this process of counting and accounting for city actions. And we see this mostly in things like the non-state actor zone for climate action, or NASCA, right, which is premised on this notion of tallying up the number of cities engaged in a number of actions, and so on and so forth. Right, so this is a thin measure of accountability, one that's sort of aimed at increasing the breadth of city engagement in climate governance, but not much more. A second dimension of this sort of global accountability involves the attempt to embed local officials and politicians in broader peer communities to increase their visibility of cities to one another. I mean, I think we can see this most readily illustrated in things like the City Climate Leadership Awards, but also in various other ranking schemes. And this is an attempt, or an ability to hold cities accountable to their commitments, right? To translate rhetorical commitments into concrete actions, to entrench cities' engagement to make it more durable over time. Speaking with city officials and politicians, there's a sense, especially with officials, that these things become a meaningful and useful way to stimulate, maintain, and hold the interest of politicians in, you know, sort of their commitment to various sustainability initiatives. So, again, this is something in which there's a depth of accountability, but one that's relatively narrow in its scope. This operates more like a club good. Right? So you can have a certain amount of cities that get nominated for awards, a certain amount that are finalists, and a very small amount that are actually able to win these things. Right? So again, we see a dimension of the disembedding of cities and the re-embedding in these sort of global relations of accountability, but again, it's a rather limited in its nature. The third, and I think the most interesting sort of aspect of this accountability, rests in the desire for cities to live up to a claim of leadership. This has become sort of the running theme in contemporary discussions about cities and climate change. This notion that cities are where the real action is at. Right? Cities have the ability to lead, they have the ability to innovate, they are where true solutions to these complex global problems will be found. Right? And resting behind this is the notion, here voiced by Michael Bloomberg, that cities speak with a single voice, and that voice must be heard. But that, of course, creates an imperative to ensure that that voice has a clarity of tone and a consistency of content. And here I think accountability systems start to play, these novel sort of global accountability systems start to serve that function, right? They start to become the mechanism through which cities can be made to speak in one voice. And so what you get is the emergence of a set of common foundations upon which this sort of accountability rests. And you get efforts to augment the capacity of cities to engage in very particular practices and in ways that are increasingly subject to sort of standardization and commonality. So we get things like the Climate Action for Urban Sustainability tool, CURB, and the City Inventory Reporting and Information System. These are both tools designed and developed in part by the C40, along with various partners, and they're aimed at enhancing the ability of cities to measure their emissions. In the case of the City Inventory Reporting and Information System, they enable them to measure their emissions, to track them over time in systematic and standardized ways. Whereas the CURB tool is actually a tool that allows cities to model the impacts of their actions. So it's a way of, excuse me, it's a way of enabling cities to engage in scenario planning, right? To be able to calculate baselines, establish possible actions, and then estimate the impacts that those actions will have, both in terms of their financial outcomes or financial costs or returns, and in terms of the amounts of emissions that they'll reduce. Furthermore, we see the creation of and diffusion of standards such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, again, a standardized way of tallying up, measuring, disclosing, and cataloging emissions over time, and things like the City Climate Planner Certification Program, operated through the World Bank, which again is about augmenting the capacity of cities to perform these tasks. And all these things are integrated with one another. They all operate on the basis of common standards. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is central to all four of these, right? And they provide cities with a means of, again, being able to being able to recognize or hold cities, render them legible, beg your pardon, in terms of the actions that they're taking. So why is this the case then? Why has there been considerable uptake of this model, of these particular practices and standards? Why do we see cities converging around this particular sort of set of principles related to global accountability? And I'm going to suggest to you that it's based on the lever of recognition. Right? Recognition, I think, is what cities seek above all else in this context. Right? And it's the ability to hold out the promise of recognition that gives this mode of governance, that gives accountability a sense of power, right, of efficacy in the world. It's that which enables the C40 and other city networks to push these ideas, to get other cities, to get an increasingly diverse and varied set of cities around the world to take them up voluntarily, right, to adopt them, to adhere to them, to invest resources in them, in spite of the fact that, as Harriet said earlier, it's not entirely sort of certain that they actually, this is the pathway towards more meaningful or effective local action or intervention. But what cities face is they face enormous financial need. Right? So if we take this estimate, this is an estimate I believe is out of date, I've seen this number actually almost twice as high as this. But this is the total estimated infrastructure gap. And here it's estimated at $57 trillion between now and 2030, a 15-year window. Right? Somewhere around the range of 70% of this is estimated to need to take place in cities. So cities are facing an enormous need to attract finance. Right? And in an era in which the extent of finance flowing to them from upper levels of government, from development banks, is rather limited, the ability to link up recognition on a particular set of terms with the possibility of gaining the reward of unlocking private sector investment is one that I think allows city networks like the C40 to set the terms upon which it means, or set the terms by which cities are engaging in climate governance. So it enables them to dictate what it means to be an urban climate governor nowadays. And so this is manifest in the desire, again, by cities around the world. You know, there's a discourse in which private capital, development banks, et cetera, are very interested in cities, but they're interested in them only to the extent that they can be de-risked, right? That they can be rendered safe places, reliable places, consistent places through which investment can be made, returns can be assessed or evaluated and generated, and investments can be made. So what does this all mean in terms of the role of cities in the global response to climate change? I'm going to suggest there's sort of three possible trajectories. One is a rather positive one, which is that cities continue to converge around these practices. We see a broadened uptake of disclosure. We see an increase in the level of convergence and conformity to these particular standards, and that this helps to effectively de-risk cities and unlock private investment and private capital. So this is one possible way to move from the sort of piecemeal or narrow approach of whatever it be, experimental governance or limited initiatives such as the C40's 2020 or the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and to achieve meaningful scale in urban in urban interventions, and to drive transformation through them. So this is sort of the positive or best case scenario in which we can see that cities can actually enact or live up to the sort of promise that they're entitled to have in terms of generating sort of meaningful global effects in terms of reducing emissions. In terms of perils, I think there's two that are worth mentioning. One is that there comes to be a disconnect or a disjuncture between accountability that's externally facing, so the outwards orientation of cities as they become more accountable, and accountability at the local level. This quote here from the former mayor of Seattle is sort of indicative of the standard case for why cities are sort of a legitimate level of governance. This idea that they have a proximity to citizens and that they are responsive to the needs of those citizens in ways that other levels of government or other governmental actors simply aren't. But if what we're seeing is true, then what's happening in cities is a sort of turning away from that model, right? It's a rendering of the city transparent to a host of external actors without much in the way of a concurrent opening up or rendering transparent or accountable to local actors. And so there's a possible danger of pursuing this route if citizens come to perceive the efforts of cities as disconnected from or non-responsive to local conditions, to local needs, to local wants and desires. And I think looming over all of this is the specter of a sort of populist pushback. Right? So whereas the discourse at the moment is focused mostly on the rise of populism at the national scale, there's no reason not to expect that those same dynamics won't be in operation if local citizens come to think that cities are working for interests or objectives that are not necessarily reflective of their own. Similarly, I think there's a need to beware as well about the reliance of an accountability-oriented governance on securing access to private capital. So this is one particular pathway towards enabling cities to engage in sort of meaningful collective action, but one that raises important questions and concerns about equity, allocation, and distribution. And so lastly, and I'll close on this, is the need to consider pathways ahead and what kind of research is needed. And I think, to my mind, one of the important and key questions is thinking about how to bridge this gap. If cities are to be more responsive to global audiences and yet face a need to remain connected to and responsive to local audiences, how can they be made to do so? So what kind of initiatives can operate that can help to bridge the divide between these two imperatives, to provide a voice for the interests, the representation, the needs of local communities and stakeholders and citizens into that process so that they don't turn away from it, they don't turn against the city and hence turn the city away from the global. And I think here there are possible signals and places to look at this, the creation of the Urban Sustainable Development Goals, the new urban agenda, the adaptation of city networks themselves to include a distinctly sort of different set of interests and initiatives, those related to energy access, starting to see network initiatives related to food justice. But again, these are relatively sort of marginal and operating on the edges. And also to think about the possibility of innovations within this domain. So we see things like the Sustainable Cities, the Gold Standard Sustainable Cities Initiative, which takes a much broader perspective on trying to calculate the effects and impacts of local urban interventions in a way that's much different than perhaps those methodologies that have been adopted by networks like the C40. So in each of these, there's the possibility of finding ways of at least opening up a counterforce or a dialogue between these two different dimensions of accountability. But I think here is an area in which more work can and should be done. I'll close off with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. So I give the floor for a few questions. We have about more than half an hour. So who wants to take the lead?
Yes, thank you. My question is David Gordon. I'm from the French Development Agency. I've come here, recommended, Irène Salençon, my colleague, recommended me to come. The question I have to you, I understand you're essentially referring to the climate issue and the urge of the cities to be accountable and to be recognized on the climate issue. Why, if that's correct, why did this urge not appear for other issues, in particular for social issues, for inclusion, etc.?
I mean, I would posit that it probably is a function of some of the things that we've been talking about before. I mean, you know, when Jeb Brugman was up and he was referring to the fact that we now live in a world that is essentially fully and entirely neoliberal in its ordering. I think it's about the fact that there's a fusion of opportunity within the space of climate governance to, you know, the imperatives of private capital. So I don't know if it's simply the fact that it's easier or it's been more opportune for networks like the C40, the Clinton Climate Initiative before it, and various other ones to be able to draw that link, right? To sell the possibility of an investment opportunity to sources of capital, and then to turn around to cities and say, well, here's the possibility. All we need to do is to prove to them that we're worthy of it. And to do that, we need to, essentially pursue a project of convergence and conformity. That's how I would understand it. And so, you know, not knowing enough about other issues to be able to really give you a definitive answer on that, I would think that climate change, because it offers so many opportunities for, you know, monetary investment, you know, there's so many different ways in which it sort of links up to, you know, those other sorts of a variety of other development agendas or investment agendas, that it is sort of particularly well suited to that.
Thank you. I could also probably answer that question a little bit, just to also say that climate change has been able to attach itself to many other different kinds of issues in a way that other kinds of sustainability previously weren't, and it's had this sort of spreading out effect that's also made it more tangible and tractable in lots of different contexts. Why it's been able to do that, I think there are a lot of different actors have got involved in making that happen, including the finance ones. But the question, I thought the two papers worked really well together, though very different styles, and both really, really interesting. Thank you. But I wanted to ask something about which cities are being included in the networks and how that actually plays into this broader kind of politics of accountability. Because there's something about the inclusion of different cities and how that actually makes the legitimacy of those cities who are already included more legitimate. So if you look at a city like Cape Town, like you mentioned, Michele, they're often invited or required to be in the network so that it enhances the accountability of others. So we wanted to ask you to think a little bit about the politics of who gets included and asked to be invited, and what those maps tell us about what constitutes legitimate urbanism and which cities aren't included. But also, Dave, for you to think a little bit about the legitimacy or the accountability, the recognition that comes from not only from the city itself, but its relations with other cities, because a lot of the kind of politics were focused on the city itself. So I think that was one thing. The other way that I saw the two papers is connected was about the different kinds of actors who then get involved in the whole arena, as Michele's maps really clearly showed us. There's a great deal of business in the green service sector, actually, and there's a new group of economic geographers looking at this idea of the green service industry and different consultancies and the kind of economy that's emerging around that. But that's also connected to the politics of accountability that you put forward. So a particular way of governing and forms of doing politics then change the actors. I suppose that's a kind of chicken and egg question. Which came first, the accountants or the accountability?
Yeah, thank you, Harriet. No, I think it's an excellent point in terms of thinking about the sort of the symbolic politics of inclusion and participation in these networks. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, you know, interesting enough, I mean, you know, there's a lot of sort of symbolic or performative politics taking place in these things. So you think about things like the awards. I mean, this is a way, I mean, it's a very thin way of holding cities accountable, but it's also completely sort of strategic and tactical in terms of how do we encourage particular kinds of actions. And if we really wanted to give an award, couldn't we just give them all to, you know, Vancouver, right? as the people of Vancouver have themselves said to me. Right. So, I mean, you know, I think there is definitely that sort of symbolic dimension to it, which I think is interesting. And I guess what I'm looking to get beyond is the sort of legitimating politics of who's involved to the extent to which these things are trying to push beyond into being able to demonstrate collective capacity. Right, you know, there's all this stuff about sort of the ability to, you know, essentially augment the individual capacity agency of cities, enable them to pursue or produce meaningful collective outcomes or effects. At least that's the way the story goes. And I think this is a very particular narrative that's crafted around that and has created its own imperative to then find a way of doing it and then proving it. And as you said earlier, I mean, whether or not that's actually connected to having a desired effect, I think, is an open question. But, you know, in this model, it's all about generating that conformity, proving a network effect, and then securing investment. And then presumably after the investment, then something magical happens, and then all the good stuff comes in terms of outcomes. So I think that's where I'm trying to get at with this, but I think how that interacts with these other sort of dimensions or politics of seeking legitimacy, I think, is an excellent point.
I guess Cape Town is a good example. I guess what needs to be added there is, so if you look at the actual numbers, it's like more than 45% of networks are by application, so there's some sort of entry screening. And that you could assume that that tells you something. I think for me, what's more telling is that 18% by invitation, which is the second largest category. It is in the category open network. Anyone can join, or it is in the category, the classic national network category, Australian network of municipalities, which is as long as you're a municipality, you're a part of the Italian network, same story. You're just by default part of it. The invitation is interesting. The invitation is relatively recent, and it is of the likes of C40 that have started to say, oh, we are just a specific type of cities, and the interesting intra-South African politics of, well, Joburg, by some numbers, is the global city, or Cape Town is, and so on. And you get into that, and I think, yeah, there is some policing there. We're doing an interesting and quite reflexive piece of work for C40 at the moment as to the point of the Chinese cities, because that is the single largest block of cities that got into C40, and it's China and India, and they got absorbed as China and India, and what happens there when you start having not just Beijing and Shanghai, but you go smaller in China. I realize that's paradoxical in China, but Wuhan and Tianjin. I think one interesting thing is actually the bigger landscape, that the efforts done by African municipalities to be on the environmental landscape versus the very limited efforts they've made to be on the health landscape versus the dominance that they have on the safety and security landscape. So if you don't compare those things, and I guess that's the same answer on the other actors. That I'm starting to think that some landscapes are dramatically, not dramatically, but substantially different. That the health landscape is dominated in a really specific way, that the security and safety landscape is a jungle because of also desperate need for funding. They don't play at the 50 millions of the C40s and so forth. So I'll just bring in Thales. Thales is a major security CCTV, well, French company, and the C40 being at the mercy of it, in a sense. So the C40, the UN Habitat being at the mercy of it for money to do networks on urban safety and security. And you think, Thank you.
We have a few other, yes.
Right. I have another question, I think, relating to also what you just said, Michele, also about kind of what gets carried back into the networks from local politics. And I mean, you mentioned kind of Joburg and Cape Town as a comparison. I think that's also kind of interesting, and I was wondering if you two could say it a little bit more, if you've done research on that, on terms of how local politics and also opposition politics influences the dealings within those networks and how maybe the overall imperatives are overriding these rivalries in order to create this common voice that is often invoked. And I mean, I can say from my own experience that, you know, Cape Town as a long-standing opposition-run city has always also used, you know, these memberships as a kind of a finger to the national government in a way, you know. So, so yeah, if you could elaborate on that point, that would be fascinating.
I'm going to ask you a question that follows on that question, which was, because I was frankly scribbling down, and I thought one interesting element there is the question of recognition and legitimacy with not necessarily just national politics, but the state and the state infrastructure, because there is clearly that element of recognition, politics of recognition with the interstate or international organization, UNFCCC and so on. And I'm wondering if you've seen anything of that, of, you know, positioning yourself back to your own national policy against the climate is a bit of a funny one, but that is a large audience in a sense of legitimators as well. I'm wondering. But. I didn't want to throw a swan. This was not planned, but I thought, okay, that's connected to it. Yes, and I guess it's interesting because if you think Johannesburg, Cape Town, you almost, and you can correct me, Harriet, but I'm going to say almost like Sydney, Melbourne. Bit of a finger to the federal government, flamboyant, independent mayor in Sydney, but also quite a bit like Patricia de Lille, strong character. That is sort of hard to be dealt with. What I find interesting there is, again, then the story could be reduced to one place, and we look at, I don't know, Melbourne and Sydney in C40, Johannesburg and Cape Town and so forth. The story gets even more telling when you go across numbers of networks. So Liverpool making a big effort at hosting the UCLG Executive Summit, because Liverpool is also out there. It isn't just London, whilst London has the C40 summit just before at the Excel and so on. And it's a really, what I find there, it's the richness of the ethnography, political ethnography you can do, and Liverpool doing it in the Liverpool City Hall in this really Britishy way versus London doing it at the Excel, actually at Siemens Crystal, giving out the Climate Leadership Awards. So you see very different national posture in there that I find it's really interesting. And very few, almost no one, I think, does sort of interlocking network analysis of this, saying, okay, how do you behave in C40 and UCLG whilst you behave nationally? And Liverpool, again, and the 10 biggest cities outside of London playing their game of their core city network in the UK. London is not in any network, so the third-tier cities have created a network of key cities which connects all those ones. And you literally see the network bit. One thing I think I'd flag, though, is that we also don't do much ethnography of it, and it speaks to, again, to Aret's question before, and then it's the people. There's a number of people, and you can count them on quite a few hands, but not too many hands, clearly less hands than we have in the room, that circulate in this environment, especially in the environmental sphere, where the new climate economy initiative is populated by similar characters. And some of us are culprits to this as well, that you sort of, your Michele pops up again in the WHO Healthy Cities discussion, but you also have the popping up of really good and meaningful people, but the current C40 executive director, who was at ARP before, the current C40 head of research, who's now driving the new climate economy effort. It is people as well. There's a social network analysis of the actual people there that could explain quite a lot of the story.
I mean, just to sort of take our question from before about the extent to which these things are utilized. I mean, essentially the same question you're saying is that there's a sort of a dynamic of recognition that cities are using strategically to bring back with them in terms of establishing their sort of positioning within national contexts. I mean, yes and no, I think certainly. I think definitely you get a sense, I mean, I'll think here about a couple of Canadian cities, but certainly you get a sense to which cities like Vancouver, like Ottawa, to a lesser extent, like Toronto, although no, not in Toronto. So maybe I'm seeing sort of different dimensions to that. There's one sense of sort of disembedding, right? I think Toronto gives you that illustration of a city that says, look, this, you know, the Canadian context is one. Sorry, I'm Canadian, by the way, so it's my natural frame of reference. And so, you know, there was a sort of disembedding and saying that we don't really care to have much influence. We know we're the top dog in Canada, right? So part of it depends, I think, probably on the sort of positioning already of your city. A city like Vancouver has been very sort of tactical in aiming to use its relationships through networks like the C40 as a means of trying to have an influence within the Canadian context, to augment their influence within the Canadian context, not necessarily to compete for it, I think, but in order to enhance it, right? Their ability to sort of reach out, and they've been very proactive in terms of certain councillors going off to other Canadian cities and saying, hey, this is, you know, come in and consult, we're going to help you develop your policies and plans, so on and so forth. So I think there's certainly an element to which that capacity to sort of draw on the capital afforded by you know, enhanced recognition, I think is in some sense being deployed in sort of the way that you're talking about. But I can't think necessarily off the top of my head of an outright sort of, you know, that sense of outright positioning in terms of you know, jockeying for position within a national context. And maybe because in climate there still remains more of an attempt to foster a collective enterprise. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not too sure at the national level.
Yeah, my question cross-cuts as most of the presentation that was made today. It's about the notion of diplomacy. It appears as some of the title, but I want to ask you whether you still think it's a relevant term for dealing with what we've just been describing as in this morning, especially how we have these very strong economically driven processes. We also have a lot of competing interest, although it's not spoken explicitly in your presentation. So is the city diplomacy still a relevant term for what we're dealing with? And also how to give an account of you were thinking about the internal politics within the network. I would be very interested to know whether we could use social network analysis for mapping city alliances, you know, how they track position on specific issues within climate change and how they sided with other cities, and how are we able to access information to map this power relationship between city, and also maybe use those kind of methodology that you've been deployed for the description of the networks.
I mean, in terms of your first question on diplomacy, I mean, so from a personal standpoint, I've never actually made use of the term in any of my work. And I think that's, I mean, I don't know if I can give you a great reason other than it doesn't resonate all that well with me. And I think in part that's because to me it's sort of redolent of the sort of transposition of state characteristics onto cities in a way that I don't think is either necessarily all that accurate or all that helpful. Right? So I think it positions cities in a way of trying to understand them as states that look a little bit different or act a little bit different. And in that sense, I think some of the things that, you know, certainly, you know, in Michele's presentation, you know, you get a sense of the richness and diversity of this terrain and the fluidity of it and the ways in which different actors come together in different constellations and configurations. I think, you know, in a much less sophisticated way, that's kind of what I'm trying to think about in my own work, is what are these constellations of actors that, you know, are configured either in explicit or in unintentional ways to organize around the production of particular kinds of actions or outcomes or objectives. And I'm not too sure that diplomacy necessarily, with that sort of notion of bringing a concrete set of demands to the process and negotiating over outcomes, to me it doesn't really, at least from my point of view, prove all that helpful. But Michele proved me wrong.
Slightly disagree, but before I slightly disagree. In terms of DSNA, yes, I mean, we do a decent amount of that. It's costly in terms of time, in terms of resources, in terms of people's resources. But I do think it does a lot, but it doesn't necessarily need to be SNA, can be other forms of network mapping, and I think it tells you a lot. What it doesn't tell you struggles to go deep. It struggles to give you the sense of the brittleness, the precariousness of it all. So we have quite a bit, and one of the last bits that we've done was, great, let's get one of our researchers said, okay, I'll get all the members and plug them all in. And it sounds such an easy thing to do, but first of all, it takes a ton of time. Second of all, it gives you a specific snapshot in time. And then you get, our own partners, a la C40 says, sorry, do you mind just adding Montreal, because they've just joined. And think, no, I will not add Montreal, because we spent 3 months plugging in every single network internet. So it sort of gives you a snapshot in time that can be always criticized for not being accurate. And you still have to make something of the politics, so more refined network analysis that has, heavy or not connections and so on. But it does a lot. I think it has legs. It's just laborious. So questionable from a policy perspective, for instance. On the diplomacy side, and that's just because I slightly disagree, but I don't. It's just a fake disagreement. But that's because, in fact, at the back of that, there's a book that I'm writing. I'm fighting with the bloody editor of Verso and the editor of Penguin at the same time as to whether diplomacy should go in the title or not. And I've always used city diplomacy more in a more provocative way, in the sense that if you talk about city diplomacy, you should be talking about it fairly to what diplomacy is, which is mediated relationships by representatives. So there's that element of representation. There's the element that the mayor of insert city is in one way or another responsible to an urban citizenry. I use it sort of in a more normative sense, in the sense that if you have the mayor of insert city, Melbourne, striking a deal with insert other set of cities, Vancouver and Auckland, to have a provision of bus systems, well, he has done it on behalf of his own citizenry, and that hits the ground as a political decision. So I think I'm using it more to flag those relationships of responsibility, if you wish. The editors don't believe that's marketable, so stay tuned for a new flashy way to say it. But I guess actually for me, it's that, and it's the diplomatic terrain, that all of this then sits underneath this large terrain of UN negotiations and state negotiations and so forth. And we worked already with 5 ministries of foreign affairs between last year and this year to upgrade their understanding of diplomatic relationships of cities. One such ministry being Canada, saying, okay, I don't understand what's the diplomatic implications of this.
Thank you. Yeah. My question is about how this international accountability works, especially in relation with sanction and blame, because the idea of accountability comes with, and also recognition comes with the idea that you can be held accountable, you can be responsible, and then therefore you can be blamed for what you have done and also be sanctioned. And in the classic local level accountability, you cannot be re-elected, for instance. And I was wondering whether or not you have seen this kind of sanctions and blame in your international networks, and how do they work? Because it seems to me that given that it is very much business-oriented, there are little incentives for cities also to blame on each other if they don't meet the targets, for instance, because the final aim is to raise money, as you said. So I was wondering whether or not you have cases of that and how this works.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's an excellent question because, I mean, in some sense, the way that accountability is used by cities departs radically from the standard way in which we think about systems of accountability, which are to hold actors to account for their promises and to find a way of saying if you don't live up to them, there's a price to pay. And that in part is what is driving this research, is to understand, to say, well, there's not really a greater sense that cities are accountable, or not necessarily obvious to whom they are, because there aren't really sort of self-evident instances of blaming and sort of holding, holding their feet to the fire to make them live up to their commitments. I think I would just nuance that in two ways. One is to say that I think there are interesting systems of accountability emerging between cities within networks like the C40, and the extent to which these systems now propagate out to other networks as the C40, kind of grows, and these things, as we heard earlier on, how this will play out in terms of what the global covenant of, I can't remember the name of the global covenant of mayors for city and energy and some other stuff, what that looks like at the end of the day, right? But within the C40, I mean, things like, the ARIP, the climate actions in megacities data set, I mean, it's presented to the public in a highly curated manner, right, in a very symbolic way, in order to make a way of sort of legitimating the claims of cities to collective authority and meaningfulness. But internally, I mean, it's fully visible, right? And so there are certainly, and I mean, Michele would have much greater access, I don't have the connections to know enough about how it's operationalized and to what extent, but from the people I've talked to, right, it is employed and leveraged as a way of encouraging cities who aren't living up to commitments of, I mean, it was, when it was being created, right, those, who are, working at the sort of head of the C40 in the Secretariat, were saying this is essentially what it's for, right? We want to be able to push our cities to stimulate action in those that aren't taking action. We want to know what they're doing, what extent they're doing it, so we can get them to do more. Coincidentally, somebody also told me they want to use it not only to tell cities to do more, but to help them to decide what it is they should do, right? To help them know what they want, what it is they should do, right? So there was already this sense of a sort of prescriptive dimension, right? And that's the fusing right there, I think, of holding to account, but using accountability in a more generative sense, right? Using it to generate, constitute, and regulate cities as actors of a particular kind, all at the same time. And then I think the other way in which accountability becomes meaningful, and here I don't have anything in the form of hard evidence that I could point to, but is the extent to which it's oriented towards these external audiences. So if it's oriented towards development banks, towards private capital, if it's about rendering cities what's that? Yeah, rendering them as sort of transparent in the service of making them more investable, right? I mean, there's a great piece I read somewhere that this was sort of about demonstrating that cities are open for business, augmenting the investability, which I don't know if that's actually a word, but augmenting that capacity in cities, right? So if they aren't, then presumably they are disciplined not by claims of you're not living up to your commitments, but by denying them the ability to gain access to funds, right? And so that becomes the lever, right? That's the mechanism of accountability rather than the more public sort of dimension of it that I think you were mentioning before. And that's the part I think is something that's interesting, and also something that's sort of, again, operates a bit out of the sort of the view of the general public, and so is something that sort of that's why it raises an interest for me in terms of trying to understand it a bit better.
I'll try to remember. I think one of the points I had relates to the fact that my feeling is that often we put everything that is city network together in the same pan, and I would ask you, wouldn't be the case to maybe really see them more separate? Because one thing is the city, the mayor,
who is either elected or civil servant and operating in that locality. The other thing is the transnational networks, which now are more or less a business. Their objective is to get as many members as they can, to have new projects, to get more people engaging in their projects. So they have very different raison d'être. They have very different objectives. They are very, although they're all within the cities and climate change story, they're very different beings. So yeah, my question was, shouldn't we be, although they're altogether separating, understanding better what their drivers and objectives, and maybe this addresses also the question, can we talk about city diplomacy? Well, if you're looking only at the networks, it's not city diplomacy, it's a transnational action thing going on. If you're looking from the perspective of the government, of the mayor, maybe it allows this kind of terminology. So it was I forgot already what was the question, but it was something more or less like this.
I have it. Good, cool. No, I agree, but I think there's an argument in doing both things, as in separating out and looking more deeply into specific category and specific typologies. Hence, for instance, saying, okay, right, we're going to spend some time this year talking to the actual cities, not the city networks, and see what the picture looks like from that side. The advantage of putting almost everything in one basket is you see the ecosystem, and that the ecosystem is a really peculiar ecosystem, but it's also an ecosystem where you have things like Rockefeller 100, and actually you have even simpler networks than that, going out representing their cities. And I've been in one too many conversations at insert UN agency, where insert name of network represents its 90, 20, 50, 30 members, and negotiates and discusses, maybe doesn't negotiate it per se, but discusses a frame of action, or it's done in a more market way and sort of gets an investor so that investor can then access its own pool of cities. So I guess, you kind of have to play a bit of both, and I agree. And eventually, after long back and forth, we went, okay, right, let's take out the national networks from the international and regional ones, because they're a different creature. One flag on the accountability story is, I suspect that it's also a different story. It's a market accountability in my mind. It isn't a political accountability. So it isn't exit and voice, it isn't sanction and blame. Yes, there's numerous stories that off the record one can tell of last year, a city being nearly kicked out of C40, but it wasn't done that way. It was done in terms of you will know. It's interesting because you could do 1970s and 60s political science on it, with cliques and gangs and people ganging up against someone, not providing you access rather than telling you off. Oh yeah, we had a meeting, we just didn't invite you. Or you can't have a spot at this. Or great application for the award this year, but we already have 5 for this. So it's, to me, that's more market accountability than political.
So we will take a few more minutes to have 2 more questions or comments and 2 more quick responses by the speakers.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to come back to the earlier question, and I found your answer very interesting, particularly for an agency like mine, which is involved in financing cities. But I sense there are two parts in your answer. Basically, I understood you said the motivation of the cities is to attract finance in the end, and it's climate, because in the context of climate there has been this initiative to finance the climate finance initiative, and that has created this movement. But as I listened to your further comments, I sense, as I was saying, there are 2 aspects. One is, I think the answer to my neighbor behind me, which is to make your city attractive generally. Therefore, to have a good reputation and to be attractive for all kinds of investment, not just climate investment. The other aspect, which you referred to in your answer to my question, was okay, we want to be accountable to attract this climate finance, particularly the private finance. But if I'm a private investor, I will invest in your city if I get my money back, basically. So is there a perception, I don't know of a private investor investing for other motives except maybe for his own reputation or her own reputation. So is there a perception somehow that achieving these commitments or these whatever indicators is going to make your city financially stronger? In other words, able to generate money and therefore to reimburse the investor?
I mean, I think there's probably sort of two answers that come to mind to that question in terms of what it is that would attract a private sort of investment into cities and what it is that they'd be looking for. So on one hand, I suppose, is the possibility that, you know, if you're looking for sort of private investor incentives, that if there is some expectation down the road that there is a, you know, regulation or some system of climate governance that is going to, you know, require corporations to demonstrate an ability to, you know, make investments that reduce emissions somewhere, to generate credits, right, that can be used in a compliance market or in a voluntary offset market, something along those lines, right, that there could be a reason for cities or for investors to say, well, that generates a benefit, right? If we can see, if cities can prove that they're taking actions that have demonstrable benefits in terms of reducing emissions, and if there's a possibility those could be monetized in the future, then that constitutes an asset of some kind. So in the narrow sense, I suppose that's one possibility, although I don't think that's the one that was really on my mind as I was formulating my answer. I think the other is that in much the same way that, I mean, as Harriet was mentioning, and has been mentioned a few times, that, you know, climate gets attached to various other things, right? So it gets attached to infrastructure investments as a way of justifying large investments in various sorts of fundamental urban infrastructure, right? As a way of sort of directing funds, and then it's made to serve those interests, you know, that are sort of then reflected in terms of climate benefits. I think in the same way that this idea of rendering cities sort of legible and recognizable to these sort of global audiences, right, to private investors, in some ways been attached to making them simply, you know, strengthening their sort of local governance institutions, right? So I think part of this has gotten tied up into, you know, there's some sort of discourse between cities and the World Bank about enhancing city credit worthiness, right, which is, as I understand it, just about augmenting the ability of cities to, you know, essentially run themselves more effectively and efficiently as sort of governance institutions, which of course would make them less risky as places to invest money, and then would enhance their appeal in terms of being able to secure, you know, capital and investment from either development banks or from private financiers. So that would be probably the other way in which I would think there's an answer to your question there, that this idea of sort of becoming more accountable as a climate governor is another way of doing that, right? It's another way of creating capacity, augmenting sort of capacity in very particular ways in terms of making cities, you know, perhaps more reliable sort of partners for investment. I don't know, Michele, if you...
Thanks. One word on the diplomacy. I think we probably do need a new word for you, Michele, because yeah, we'll try and get one by the end of the day. But for me, it was the last part of your comment there, that all of this is happening in the shadow of the UN system and the nation states, which of course would not be a position that I would agree with. And I think actually your analysis doesn't show that. I mean, part of it is. I also don't like the kind of idea of the shadow, because those agencies are right in there. But actually it's like, what is the forum in which this diplomacy is taking place? And it tends to kind of assume some form of international forum rather than multiple different kind of fora at different levels and scales, and I'm not quite sure what that looks like in diplomatic terms. And the diplomacy tends to, you know, it's the Ferrero Rocher and the ambassador and the European Union. But I think I just wanted to follow up also on Johanna's comment just now about what we're putting together and why, and what things we're bringing together, and what does that serve us. And from my perspective, at least, I think it's important to separate the idea of how is climate change governed in a city, or how is carbon or resilience or something governed in a city, which may be partly through these kind of networks and through these forms of diplomacy, but certainly isn't in total. It's also governed by, say, decisions by supermarkets about how much milk and meat to sell, or the decisions of house builders and standards and regulations and all sorts of other things, the infrastructure development, everyday decisions that we all take about how we move ourselves around a city, most of which have nothing to do with climate diplomacy, if we're going to call it that at all. So there's a question of how is carbon being governed, which these things are shaping, but are certainly not fully they're not fully comprehensive of. And then there's a question of how is the urban governing of climate change being institutionalized and made political in these kind of transnational networks. And then I think that's where it makes sense to bring these things together. So I don't know whether that was something towards where you were going, but that's what it made me think.
Thank you, but they'll still respond. See, Michele is ready to respond.
Oh, no.
Go ahead, yeah.
To agree. And again, bring me another word. Desperately need another word. And I agree. Long story short, I agree. What is it? Question mark. I agree. Actually, you're completely right that it isn't in the shadow of. In the shadow of is the wrong is the wrong term, and it is in the shadow of the UN system. If it is in the shadow of anything, it's in the shadow of the broader global governance milieu, or diplomatic milieu works here actually, so I can just stick to milieu, but diplomatic terrain. I think what it is in the shadow of from time to time, or what isn't in the spotlight, is the international political economy that sits behind, or at times right at the front of this. So the philanthropies that sit at the front, and the large investors, the Honeywells and Shell and so on, that sit at the back. And I guess that's partly another bit of the answer that I would give to that comment. That then there's the whole element of accountability. So the ability to count also makes cities, and I'm just repeating C40 logic here, by the way, makes cities more investable, if that's a word, or credit worthy, because I can pool cities and invest in pools of cities that are not your traditional pools of the UK cities. So I can put together São Paulo, Mexico City, Auckland, and Vancouver, because they count the same way, so I can hold them accountable in my investment. Now that's investment logic, very well tested now in pool procurement by Honeywell, by Siemens, by Cisco, by IBM. So the capacity not just to make them accountable, but also to read them as a single market, or read them as a selectable market. And again, that's what I'm saying, you're completely right. It is in the shadow of a larger global political economy, international political economy, global governance, sometimes on international stages, sometimes it creates its own transnational stage to do stuff.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Mr. Chair, would you like to?
Okay, well done, Olivier. Well, I just will close this very interesting session. I just want to tell you that we are running a bit late. Thank you, Olivier. And so we have about 10-minute break to have coffee, tea, or water, or whatever. There's some wine left, I guess. I'll come back here in about 10 minutes. Thank you.